Welcome, everybody, to another session of the National Library of Israel's Reading Room, sessions of public events, in this case, interviews with collectors. And it's really an honor to discuss today with Bill Gross, William Gross, a great mensch in the world of Judaica collectors, so full of slick, difficult people who hide, private collectors who hide their collections from the public, people who care more about money and the bottom line than they do about the items themselves, people with adversarial relationships with other collectors and collections. Though in a world full of that, Bill is the antithesis. He loves the material. He works constantly to make sure that the material in his collection and other collections is available to researchers and the general public. And he's all around a nice person. So it's really an honor to be speaking virtually with Bill today, and to see some other sides of his collection. And maybe we should start with a little bit of background. Bill, can you tell everybody something about yourself, how you found yourself an American expatriate living in Tel Aviv, wandering around the world, sharing your items, collecting items, buying items, finding items, learning about items, studying items, inviting in researchers and lay people to see them, sending these items out to museums and collections around the world. Give us some background.
Yoel, if I were really to do that, we wouldn't have time for a discussion, for your questions, for anybody else's questions, and certainly also not for the short presentation which I prepared for the end of our interview. But basically, if I'm to judge by my baby book, which my mother began keeping the day I was born and kept it going through 7 years, I became a collector at the age of 6 years old. Of course, not Judaica, but matchbooks and playing cards and bubblegum cards. And I think anything I could really think of, ending up in the great field of hotel soaps, which my father and all our friends used to collect when they traveled and bring them back to me, which, by the way, showed up 6 months ago in my sister's house. And I told my nephews to put it online, and it sold for almost $1,000. Really, really amazing. So I've been collecting all that time. And certainly when I met my wife, Lisa Gross, whose father, Maurice Spertus, is one of the great Judaica collectors of the United States, and whose collection now constitutes the Jewish Museum, the Spertus Museum of Judaica in Chicago. He was like a second father to me, and I adored him, and he was a great inspiration. And as my Jewish identity became more central to my own identity, it kind of melded with this collecting instinct, and Judaica became my passion. This was before I moved to Israel at the age of 29. I really began collecting at the age of 24. And it just continued ever since.
Can you say something about the world behind the scenes? Where do you find things? How do you find things? What's involved in expanding a collection? How do you decide what to acquire and why?
Well, I think there's basically 4 options for that. First of all, of course, auction houses. And I'm not a great fan of auctions, neither selling nor buying.
How come?
Second of all, there's privates, families. That doesn't happen very often. Third, there's what used to be stores of antique dealers. Now they're also mainly on the web. And fourth, there are dealers who go around from collector to collector. And the main portion of my own collection came from these dealers, these, I guess, a traditional Jewish peddler, but in a slightly more elevated kind of thing than rags and old clothes and ribbons and the kinds of things that we see these classic images of almost everywhere. So those are the places that they do it, and it really isn't so behind the scenes. I never was a particularly private person in that way, and I think very soon, virtually every Judaica in the world knew of me, and quite soon I didn't have to wander anywhere. It was very easy. All I had to do was answer the door, and there was another dealer with items to offer to me.
And how do you pick what to acquire?
Well,
What
I
are your
have
priorities?
always had since the very beginning. I hate to use the word vision because I'm not a visionary, but I had an idea as to what I wanted to do. I really viewed Judaica, I think, in kind of a museological context, that I had an idea that I wanted to assemble objects that represented the Jewish world, that I would be able to have items from most countries where Jews lived. At one point, I divided the Jewish world into 10 different cultural areas. And I think what I did was tried to have representative items of both public, that is synagogue objects, and home objects that were representative of each of those areas. And that's how I tried to build the collection. I was less of a buyer bahizdamnut, by chance. I really had a fairly good idea as to what I was looking for. And at some points, I even had lists that I would give to dealers. This is what I'm looking for.
And just about everything in your collection is not just textual, it has a visual element, a striking image, a aesthetic piece, calligraphy, a drawing, a three-dimensional image. What draws you to that side of things?
I think what we would say lack of choice. The fact is I have no background, no yeshiva background. My halachic knowledge is minimal. Of course, I can read a Hebrew newspaper, but if you put a text from North Africa written in cursive Judeo-Arabic, I can't read it. And it's still difficult for me, even though I'm better at it, reading Rashi's script. So for me to open a book or collect a book because of its content that I can't understand makes no sense to me. So I zeroed in on this idea of visual, of things that really represented a different view of Jewish culture and Jewish existence. And that really became very quickly honed into the idea of a ethnographic, cultural, geographic view of Judaica. What really began to interest me was what was the meaning of these objects, not necessarily in terms of their spiritual meaning or their halachic meaning, but their meaning in terms of Jewish life. What did they tell us? What stories did they tell us about how Jews lived and how they related to the place that they lived in?
So that's a great segue into some of the items that you want to share from your collection, and I invite you to share your screen so that everybody can see the images that you've put together. But while you're doing that, I'm going to break character for a second and let the listeners know that Bill is being modest here when he says that he doesn't really understand the content. He does understand the content. Any collector and scholar who has spent time with him knows that the first thing you do when you're talking to Bill Gross about an item in his collection is shut up and listen, because that's where you're going to learn something.
All right.
Okay, let's figure out how to get the your screen shared.
I think so. At least that's how my good friend Doron taught me how to do it this afternoon.
Okay, I don't see it at the moment.
All right, let's
click on the share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, that I did. And
Okay, and then you should have to pick out one of the screens to share. Pick
oh
out the
yeah, that I
PowerPoint.
did here.
Oh,
And
and there it is.
oh, you got it now? Okay,
Yeah,
terrific.
I see it.
Very
I
good.
see it.
Very good. All right.
So,
I'm sorry, just click on the chalice to make it big.
Okay. I can't. You're not getting the slideshow, you're getting the other part? I don't,
yeah, I'm not seeing the slideshow. We're seeing your
well,
screen.
it worked.
Click.
It
There it
worked.
goes.
Oh,
There
there
you
you
go. Now we've got it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So, in most of my day-to-day experience dealing with the National Library of Israel, I end up dealing with two-dimensional objects. But you've started off. You want to start off with your presentation with some of the three-dimensional objects. I usually deal with texts, but you also deal with some great ritual objects, some Judaica, and maybe that's a good place to start here.
Yeah, it probably is, Yoel, but what I really want to illustrate with the objects that I'm going to show is how I look at these things and how I try to relate them, as I stated before, to the cultural environment or the general environment in which Jews lived for all these centuries. So let's just take a look at what I'm talking about. The first thing I'll talk about is Hanukkah lamps, because there's probably no item which ubiquitously appears in almost all Jewish homes across the world. I think even more than the Kiddush cup, which is probably second in that way. And therefore, we're able to look at a lot of different places that have these things. And I'll show just a few examples to try to illustrate what I mean. So we have here a beautiful brass Hanukkah lamp from Rome, 19th century, and this general form, either with or without a candelabra in the middle, basically was a Roman Hanukkah lamp for more than 200 years. And if we look on the right-hand side with a wonderful building in Rome, I think we don't have to look far to see what the origin of the design is. And you can see everything from the round and wide kind of semicircle up above, the pillars, even though they're not exactly the same, they're pillars, even to the oculus that you see on the building, and again is represented on the Hanukkah lamp. You know, in the last half of the 19th century, there was an incredible economic boom in Europe. And it's the era in which France, for instance, in Paris, the city was completely redesigned and rebuilt. It was like a cultural explosion took place because an amazing number of wealthy industrialists, merchants, and of course, governments suddenly had money. And cultural institutions were established throughout Europe. And one of those institutions was theaters. Instead of being just in the few big cities, virtually every town, even shtetls of 10, 15, 20,000 people, began to have theaters and opera houses that appeared. And in each of these institutions, of course, on the stage was a curtain, which opened and closed in order to present the performance. Well, one of the motifs that was particularly popular on these things was a peacock. And if you can envision this colorful peacock being unveiled in the opposite way as it was, and the performance is there and the curtain closes again, and you have this beautiful image. Now, these curtains are long gone, but we do have one more concrete example in the Tivoli in Copenhagen, in their outdoor theater, which represents that. And this Hanukkah lamp from Prague in 1872 literally represents this theater. And you can see the valences up here, which of course are always above that curtain. The peacock represents the curtain. And if we think about it, and you think about the Hanukkah ceremony with people gathered around, the lights burning, the reflection on the silver backplate, people singing. What is it if not home theater? People have to sit in homes. This is a beautiful, elegant Viennese Hanukkah lamp from 1840. And of course, that's the Biedermeier period. And it nothing so much as represents or resembles a nice Biedermeier couch that you see on the right side, of which there are numerous examples, and which you can probably see in virtually any bourgeoisie house that you entered in Vienna during that period. Now, there's specifically Jewish contexts as well. On the left is a brass Hanukkah lamp. They were made in both the 18th, 19th, and even 20th centuries, where they've been reproduced quite, I would say, excessively. This is a very old one, and you can see here in the roof and maybe the interior of a synagogue with the arch doors, and maybe this piece represents the railing that you see here, but particularly these little dormer type windows, which you see directly taken from the kind of wooden synagogue architecture that was quite incredible. It was really these wooden synagogues from Eastern Europe that brought me to my theoretical interest in Jewish art. I started out with an interest in synagogue architecture because they are so fantastic and in many cases pagoda-like. And when I was doing some research for my honors thesis in 1959 in New York, there was a Polish import store that had, by the couple Piochotka, a book on wooden synagogues that opened an entire new world for me. And here we can see it basically related to the Hanukkah lamp that was used in the same areas of the Ukraine and Poland. Here we have a very interesting lamp, because as opposed to almost all other lamps, this back is heavily decorated, probably stamped in some way. And if you look at the inset on the right, you see all these military images, drums, trumpets, bayonets, all the things, flags, all these things. And of course, today we can easily relate to that and say, well, yeah, that represents the Maccabees' victory, and they're recapturing the temple and then lighting the menorah, and that's what it represents. But the truth is, until the Zionist movement came out and basically began to co-opt the idea of Hanukkah as a military victory, the main theme of Hanukkah was the miracle of the lights. And so this is the 18th century. It certainly was not that. And so it probably represents something else. You can see this ligature at the bottom of FR, which happens to stand for Fredericus Rex, who was the king of Prussia. And if you look, we can find exactly where they come from. And this is part of a helmet of a grenadier in an 18th century army. And we know of about 15 different ones, mainly taken from Fredericus Rex's armies and the others from Maria Theresa's armies in Austria. And obviously it's a secondary use, and probably because it had been polished so much by the soldier that it developed these holes, he discarded it, and it was picked up by used clothes dealers who were mostly Jews during this time. And somebody got the idea of making it into a Hanukkah lamp because polished brass backplate was a wonderful reflector for the light. Now we have things not only in the area of three-dimensional things, but getting into items that are more popular within the National Library, who has one of the biggest Ketubot collections in the entire world, if not the biggest. I have a number of Ketubot, and I think some of them are very special as well. And I just want to show you a couple that have some context to them. This one I bought many, many, many years ago. It's from Meknes, Morocco from 1856. And as I began to see more Ketubot from Meknes, I realized that this is the way, the form, the style of Ketubot from Meknes. And when I finally got to Meknes for the first time, some 30 years ago, I walked into the central square and turned around and nearly fainted, because there was my model for this ketubah. You can see very, very clearly the arch, the decoration around the arch, the straight decoration above, the decoration going around the thing. Now, people didn't do things literally, but they used them as models. And here, the artist of this ketubah was doing nothing but copying what he saw every day as he walked the streets of Meknes. This is a magnificent ketubah on the right-hand side from Istanbul, from the Komondo family, from 1849. It's more than 4 feet high. It's decorated with gold leaf, very fine representations of flowers, and it obviously denotes something of wealth. The Komondo family, by the way, was known as the Rothschilds of the Ottoman Empire, an extremely wealthy family, eventually had a fight with the Sultan and took everything that they had and moved to Paris, where they became the great supporters of Impressionist artists. And no small portion of Impressionist art in the Louvre and in the Petit Palais are from the family of Komondo, where it was donated. And there's a museum of decorative arts on the Komondo family name in Paris today as well. But this is 1849. And we look at this place in the corner, in the 2 corners, and I've enlarged it here because we have this series of houses. Now why? It's not a Jewish symbol for sure. Why would it be on a ketubah? And I began to look into it, and I found an incredible phenomenon. And that is, if you look here, it turns out that the wealthy society of Istanbul, of the Ottoman Empire, had vacation homes, weekend homes on the Golden Horn. And I guarantee you, so did the Komondos. And this is a social statement on their ketubah, that they are members of that society and that level of participation in that society in Istanbul. Printed books also show us really wonderful things. This, as you can see, is a Tikkun Sofrim, which is a Bible which could be used by Sofrim to write a Torah because they were very correct, from 1666. And it has a beautiful title page. Not only was it printed beautifully, but afterwards it was decorated as well, also with gold point, a beautiful gold tool leather binding. And this represents, again, a social phenomenon of the Sfaradim in Amsterdam. The Jews arrived to Amsterdam at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. They were Sfaradim who were leaving Portugal and Spain because of the Inquisition. And they came to Amsterdam because of the tolerant religious atmosphere there. And they were amazing, amazing people, both culturally and in terms of their wealth. Many of them were international merchants. And they began to create a society there. And we begin to see in the printing industry, in the way that the life was lived there, a quite incredible level from these people. And this is the kind of book which they wanted and was printed for them at this time. Italy was no less a center of really wonderful art, of course. We'll talk a bit about that later. And here's a wonderful title page of biblical scenes from a Bible printed in Mantua in 1742. And I want you to take a look at the enlargement of this particular scene right down here, which you see on the right, which is Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. But look up here. It's a representation of God. Now, I'm sure I don't have to explain to you that that's a rather unusual thing for religious Jews. And in 1742, there were only religious Jews, and most certainly a Hebrew Bible was printed only for religious Jews at that time. Now, if we think about what might happen today, if somebody dared print a Bible with a title page, with an illustration of God on it, I don't have to tell you that there might be a minor explosion, not perhaps relevant or parallel to Beirut, but within the religious world, something similar. And we can find many things like this. And if anybody's interested, at some time we can discuss, because I have dozens of books that were printed with images that would be verboten today completely and totally. Another, the Amsterdam printing was just magnificent. They continually illustrated the title pages with wonderful woodcuts and copper engravings. And this is a book in Yiddish, Sefer Melitz Yosher. Melitz Yosher is a phrase in Jewish tradition which represents an advocate before God, somebody who is looking after the living among those who are no longer with us. And it's really very, very beautiful. But what's interesting is also this quite lovely Hebrew script inscription on the right-hand side, which says, Diese Sefer Melitz Yosher Shayach Lemarat Mindele Die Rebbetzin min Amsterdam. This book, Melitz Yosher, belongs to Miss Mindele, the Rebbetzin from Amsterdam. And it's the kind of thing that we find in books that, in my mind, adds greatly to their value and adds a sweetness to it, because this book is in essence the weekly parashot written in Yiddish, which was the language for women at that time. This isn't even to get into the incredible world of illustration and visual nature in Jewish manuscripts and, of course, books. But here I've just laid out a group of manuscripts of which I could give you from my collection 150 more, and from the collection of the National Library, several thousand. And they're fascinating because they, again, relate to the societies they did. Here we have one from Germany, here from Italy, here from Algeria, here from Yemen, here from Hungary, here from Morocco, here from Iraq. And you can go through virtually any place where Jews lived and created Jewish life and find these wonderful illuminated or illustrated books that, again, relate directly to the cultural milieu in which they were created. Only in Italy. Why do I say only in Italy? Because Italy is the place for anything dealing with art. And I'm sure you've heard, as I heard during my college years, that if you would take and total up all the works of art in Italy, it would more than equal all the works of art in the rest of the world. And having visited Italy many times happily, I believe that that's true. I wanted to take one object in my collection from Italy and try to show you and go into some depth of how it's possible to analyze these things. So let's take a look. On the left-hand side, we're looking at two wooden objects which are carved. These are the upper part of Taurus staves, which you can see in this manuscript, which, by the way, is a Spanish manuscript from the 13th century, which was unillustrated, and it wound its way to Italy, and about 1400 was illustrated in Perugia. And here we see a man holding a Torah, and as opposed to what we know today of putting silver rimonim on Sifrei Torah, the Atzei Chaim themselves were very large and represented a form of decoration. And I think it's very parallel to what we see here. Now, the only original part of these is the parts right in here that you see. And we'll discuss, it says here circa 1470, and let's see how we get to that, because I will tell you that 15th century Judaica outside of manuscripts almost does not exist. I would imagine that if you were to pick a number between something like the number of figures you have on two hands and maybe 15, you would be hard put to find 15 objects from the 15th century which have survived three-dimensional. We have a number of bronze Hanukkah lamps, which we know, and a few wooden ones, which we'll get to as we progress. So if we look at these from all the different views, and we can see that they're inscribed, and the inscription identifies a person. So it's Nathanael Trabo, and if you see this little mark here, that in Hebrew writing represents something missing or indicates an abbreviation. And in this particular case, it's a T. The family name was Trabot, son of our teacher, the Rabbi Reb Levi. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of the acquisition because it's quite incredible. Some 35 years ago, a small book dealer in Jerusalem died, and his son went to his store and warehouse and began cleaning it out, and he invited everybody to come in and buy what was left there. That wasn't his interest. And among other things was a pair of Atzei Chaim sitting in the corner. Now, you have to imagine these on the long Eitz Chaim and with another handle down below, and they're like, 2-3 feet high. And everybody knows that in the field of Judaica, nobody collects Taurus Staves. What do they have to offer? They're too big, they're hard to store, you can't display them. Nobody's interested in them. And they sat there, and he put a price of $200 on them, and people came in and out for 2 years. Nobody was interested. And finally, one day, an American yeshiva student who was at a yeshiva in Jerusalem walked in. Now, here we have to differentiate between yeshiva students between Jerusalem and the United States, where yeshiva students get a general education in addition to a religious education. And this fellow had obviously been exposed to art. And as all of you can obviously see, there's something that reminds one of the Gothic period here. And he also felt that. And so he asked the guy if he could take him on consignment. He took them on consignment, he brought them to Tel Aviv, and he brought them to a dealer who was very instrumental in my building my collection, became a good friend, was very knowledgeable himself, had spent a great deal of time in Italy, and knew very well what Gothic looked like. He also knows my taste and the kinds of things that I'm interested in. And so the same day he brought them to me. Now, you have to understand that these started out that morning at $200. By the time they got to me, I would say that they were offered for considerably more. And I think that if you would say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and a little bit onward, we would be getting toward the price that he was asking. And I was faced with a choice because carved Gothic could be one of two periods. It could be the period that it seems to be, or it could be the period of the last half of the 19th century when there was no pronounced style in Europe, and you had a period of neo-styles, neo-Romanesque, neo-Gothic, neo-Egyptian, neo-everything. And these could be a neo-Gothic carving because I happen to have two pieces. I love the Gothic. I have two pieces of Gothic carved furniture in my living room, which were carved in Belgium in the 19th century as part of this revival stylistic trend that was going. But I was convinced and I was willing to take the chance, and I bought them. And I began to do some research about Nathanael Trabot. Amazingly, I find him. He was a scribe. There are 5 manuscripts from the 15th century in libraries across the world, signed by him. A great scholar, Ottolenghi in Italy, did some research on him and found that he was also a merchant. He was a Renaissance man. He was a scribe. He was a merchant. He was a famous rabbi. The first book with approbations. Approbations in printed Hebrew books are recommendations by rabbis, famous rabbis, that this book is a great book, and they were printed in the book. And the first book that carries these recommendations, he's one of the rabbis recommending them. So I became convinced that they were real, was very, very happy with my acquisition because they just don't exist. And so I knew when they were from, more or less, but I knew that they have these late Gothic motifs, that they were a man who lived at that time, but there was still a doubt in my mind as to what they represented. And there was only one way I could find out, and that was carbon-14 testing. I'm sure that a number of you remember well Professor Bezalel Narkis, who was a very, very good friend and colleague of mine for many, many decades. And I took these to Tzali and I said, what do we do? He said, well, if I remember correctly, at the Weizmann Institute, they do carbon-14 testing. So I called up the Weizmann Institute, made a date, we took them in there, and they said they could do it, but they needed an ounce of scrapings in order to do the test, where they burn it and record some kinds of lights coming off it, and that's how they calculate the years, having to do with a decline in radioactivity from a certain measurement, which is constant. So these happen to be a boxwood. Boxwood is an incredibly hard wood, and that's why you can have these wonderfully detailed Gothic carvings on them. So they brought us surgical scalpels, and we sat there for 2 hours. The only place that was reasonable was in these openings where they attached at one point to the Atzei Chaim, because all the rest of the places were finished, and the finish would distort the results. It took us more than 2 hours. We broke 27 surgical scalpel blades in order to accumulate 1 ounce of material, which we finally did. And several months later, I received this letter from them stating that they give me the 2 different values from the 2 different Atzei Chaim, and then say this brings them together at 1390 plus or minus 70 years. So I was satisfied. Today I think they can do it plus or minus even 20 years, but that was the state of the art at that time. So now I knew really where they were from in general, when they were from rather specifically, but I still had to figure out where. And at that time in 1989, I wrote a letter, which I still have a copy of, to a good friend in Firenze, Professor Doralicia Ben-Poad, and who is a great expert in Italian decorative arts, and asked her if she would write them up. And she answered me that she would, but at the moment she was busy. But during the future, she would try to do it. Okay, now we go forward 30 years. I had my 80th birthday in October, and now I'm going to make a plug for the book. There was a book published with 22 essays by my wonderful friends and colleagues in the field. And she wrote an essay finally after 30 years. She was still busy, but she agreed to do it this time, of trying to place them. And she does a fabulous analysis of where they come from, showing parallel things, even to the point of the famous bell tower in Modena and the same kind of shaped windows with 2 windows within a rounded thing. And it's just brilliant. And she comes to the conclusion that they are from Modena, that they probably were made around the same time as this Gothic carved ark, which has an inscription from Modena from 1472. We don't know whether the accompanying a reader's desk is exactly from the same time, but she thinks that the Atzei Chaim are related very much to this ark, and very likely were done in the same place. And I thank you. I hope that gives you an idea of how I try to approach Judaica. And I really thank you for being with me. I get no greater pleasure than life than sharing these things with other people, even though I know a lot of you have heard me far too often on these things, but thank you for joining me.
So I want to keep going and follow up on a few of these things, particularly some thoughts of yours on the relationship between the aesthetic and the cultural and the content. One of the privileges that I have working at the National Library of Israel is to have so much of the textual tradition of the Jewish people at our fingertips, and we tend to see as library people, we tend to see the aesthetic side as somewhat secondary to the content. And here, what you're showing, demonstrating in so many examples, is that content and aesthetics are working together in order to, well, I don't know if it's quite a function, but that Jews are so involved in the cultures around them, and they're so absorbed in the aesthetics of the cultures around them. How much does that affect in your experience the distinctiveness of Jewish items? If there's so many parallels to what's going on culturally and visually and aesthetically in the environments around, what makes these uniquely Jewish?
I don't think they are uniquely Jewish. You have to differentiate between form and style. So if you take form, you have a Hanukkah lamp with 8 lighting elements, okay? Or you have rimonim, which are a pair, which are used in almost all Jewish cultures. So you have a Jewish form. But style, there is no such thing as a Jewish style. It doesn't exist. Everything that we have in some kind of visual element in Judaism is copied from something else. I don't want to get into the philosophical argument that there's a great deal in Judaism, Bichlal, also spiritually and philosophically and ritually that's taken from outside, because I don't want to get into a fight with whatever religious people are watching this. But the fact is that we have made it a unique part of our culture. The same thing with these other things that came outside. We have put it together in a different way, but we're of course a part of world culture. We can't be separate from it. And that's the beauty of it. The beauty of it is that we have all these different stylistic objects which come down to exactly the same spiritual element that Jews celebrate everywhere. If you take the Catholics, you go and Catholic ritual objects have the same form virtually in every country that they're used. That is a pervasive thing. I don't know if we were more adaptable or perhaps weaker culturally. I don't know, but Jews have always engaged with their elements, the cultural elements and the society around them. And it's one of the things that I think we don't appreciate today, and is given a wonderful proof exactly by this phenomenon of these ritual objects and manuscripts and printed books, which are a part of world culture. It's our part. And why do we have to be unique in that way? There's no need. Our taking all these things together, we have built a unique package, but all the parts don't have to be unique.
That's a great answer, and I think it also this has been under the surface and the subtext of what you've been saying, but there's this illusion that Judaism has no aesthetic tradition, that somehow the Ten Commandments prohibit us from making an image of God, and there's this sense that Judaism doesn't deal with images at all. And of course, your collection, like so much of Jewish art, demonstrates that there is this vast aesthetic tradition in Judaism. And then there's these fuzzy borders where you get these troubling images, but that are still quite real, of images of God in some of the books. And that's where you get to kind of the fuzzy borders.
I didn't want to show Yoel the Siddur frontispiece with a nude woman, but maybe next time.
There are a whole bunch of those.
Well, not Siddurim. They're halachic books, but this is a Siddur carried into the synagogue in order to pray from.
Now, it might keep, in case you get bored during prayers, gives you something to pay attention to.
By the way, I just want to say that Yoel is a very tough taskmaster, and there was another part to the presentation dealing with amulets, visual mysticism, which is a very, very, I'm very passionate about that. I mean, I have a very, very large collection of practical Kabbalah, which is mainly amulets and other things. I just see on my screen Emma Abate, and she's well familiar with that and deals with some of the same wonderful traditions in that way. And I truly hope that at some other time, maybe we can get together again and discuss that issue. And Yoel, I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No, that's fine. Actually, I might be a tough taskmaster, but you know me well enough to know that cutting amulets and magic out of any talk is something that pains me as much as it pains you, given my love for Jewish magic. But I'd like to open up with the last 10 or 15 minutes that we have to some of the questions that had come up in the chat, beyond a long list of really, really glowing appreciation of this great talk. One of the questions that came up was about wimples, the Torah wrapping that was traditionally in German countries, in German-speaking areas, was traditionally donated in honor of the Brit Milah, in honor of the circumcision of a young boy. And somebody asked about the age of those. If I recall correctly from the recent book in your honor, you have some of the earliest wimples that we know of. Can you say something about where they come from, what geographical locations they came from, how far back we have examples, and how they fit in with the larger cultural milieu of Central Europe?
Sure. I mean, it's a tradition of German-speaking areas. It's hard to say Germany because, of course, in the 16th century, when the earliest ones probably come from, there was no Germany. But there were German-speaking areas, and so we can find wimples from today, from the 16th century up till today, from what is now Germany, Switzerland, Alsace in France, Luxembourg, Denmark, and it covers all of these areas. And we think that the tradition that it comes from the German custom of wrapping a child in a long textile banner, as it were. I think that they considered it healthy, and the arms were put in, everything was put in, and it's a long piece of cloth about the same size as the wimple. And while the wimple didn't serve the same purpose, it very well may be based on that kind of tradition. Of course, these are textiles, and as passionate as I am about practical Kabbalah and illustrative Kabbalah, I love textiles, and I have a collection of about 40 wimples. I think each one more important than the last because I've had 55 years to pick and choose of what's been brought to me and what I've seen. You know, if you weren't such a tough guy, I would have probably brought some out. But And they're wonderful because they also preserve a tradition of lettering. And by the way, Yoel, when you talk about text, there are any number of manuscripts that I have in my collection, which I bought for the aesthetic beauty of the text, of the way that the Sofer was writing.
So I lobbed you a softball question and gave you an opportunity to plug the book that just came out in honor of your 80th birthday. And if you're not going to plug it, then I will. It is a great, accessible, beautiful, aesthetically gorgeous, carefully researched set of papers on and related to items from Bill's collection, bringing them into conversation with related items from other Jewish and non-Jewish collections. So I don't, my copy is on the shelf over there, and I'm not going to get up and look for it, but I recall that the cover was in your PowerPoint. So can you give us a plug for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a wonderful book. I'm amazed that it didn't garner a whole group of international prizes, both for the content and the aesthetics. But then I think I'm prejudiced. I mean, for anybody who's interested in it, it's available from the Walberg Press in Zutphen in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, they don't have much international distribution, but they were great publishers. And you know, I think it's really a worthwhile book to have. And again, the kind of thing that I tried to do with the Taurus Staves is done in each of the articles in there concerning different things that I felt to be very, very important in the collection.
So I stuck a link to that book in the chat, but we have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like you to say something about your interaction with the academic world, how you see the role of private collectors in relationship to academics, researchers, who need access to materials, often don't have the financial resources to provide it for themselves. Academic libraries, of course, like the National Library of Israel and others, are always involved in trying to expand the resources available to researchers. But what do you see the role of private collectors relative to that of researchers?
It's hard for me to really answer that, Yoel, because I think I've never really viewed myself or my collection as a private collection. I've always viewed it as a private collection, a public collection. And my view has kind of always been that all of these things in all of these places belong to the entire Jewish people. You know, I've been given the privilege to curate them during the time I'm alive, but hopefully they'll end up in public collections where they'll continue to be open. Unfortunately, private collectors tend to be very private, and they, for whatever reason, think that if they own something that's unique insofar as that's a real term, if nobody else knows about it, it's worth more money and it's more important. And that if everybody knows about it, it's going to reduce the value of it. And since most certainly with almost all collectors, the economic side is an element and an important element. Nobody wants to lose money, even though certainly in this field that over the last 10 years has been almost a priori true, but that's a fact of history. I wish and I push other collectors to make their collections more public, but they're not. I would say that most of them are not terribly interested in really learning that much more about. They love, not that they don't love their objects, they most certainly do, but it's in a different kind of way. To me, the most important three things in looking at Judaica are context, context, and context. And without that, they don't have any meaning. They simply are objects without any relationship to anything. So, and the age of looking at objects, I mean, people aren't even object oriented these days. You know, if you look back 30 years ago, you would find an exhibition of Kiddush cups at the Jewish Museum in New York. Vitrines, one after the other, displaying a Kiddush cup. I mean, nobody would dare, and if they did, nobody would come today to an exhibition without contextual information in it. So, to me, the other thing that is a law of mine is that every day that I don't learn something new is a lost day. And who can I learn from? Well, I learn from everybody. Academics, I mean, my God, these people have taught me so much over the decades. Every contact I have with them brings me new viewpoints on the items, new knowledge on the items. I can't go and research incredibly deeply. I have thousands of objects in my collection, and I just can't do it. I do as much as I can, and my collection is very well documented. I have more than 50,000 high-resolution photographs of items and pages of manuscript in my collection, and I offer them for nothing to everybody. Scholars, publishing houses. You have all my manuscripts and printed book images. I mean, that's the only way one can learn is by exchanges. And so for me, academia is a resource, and you can't get something without giving something. It just doesn't happen in life, and I'm happy to do it. It's just the most wonderful way to live and have a collection. So I wish that private collectors would relate to that more. And people have in academia have just been so good to me that, you know, I'm just asir todah. I'm really a grateful servant.
Well, I want to end not only by thanking Bill for his time, for his knowledge, for his insight, for his generosity. I want to end with a little story, a story that has yet to come to fruition, but I hope it will shortly, which is a meeting of two sister manuscripts, which I hope we'll be able to arrange in the next couple of weeks when we're actually able to see each other in person. But a woman called me up, a woman named Daphne Moshayev from Jerusalem, to say that she has items from her great-great-great-great-grandfather from Germany, and she was wondering whether they might be appropriate for the National Library of Israel. She brought in the items, and among them was a Judeo-German, that is to say, German, not Yiddish, in Hebrew characters, explanation in beautiful calligraphic 18th century Central European handwriting, explaining the new astronomy, the astronomy of Copernicus and Galileo, and the structure of the planets. And it turns out that this beautiful manuscript, including drawings, is the sister of a manuscript in Bill's collection, the Hebrew version of that. And the story goes, it's clear from the title page of the German manuscript, that I'm forgetting his first name, Frankel is his last name, had written this book on astronomy in Hebrew, and his mother, who did not read Hebrew, but only understood German in Hebrew characters, asked him to translate this little booklet for her. And so he made a copy and a translation from the Hebrew into the Judeo-German. This man's and his mother's descendant in the early 20th century published this book in German characters, which we also have in the National Library collection. And I'd like to bring these two together, these two sister manuscripts, and show how serendipity and history and the way these things come together, and show us also this integration of Jewish culture and general culture, general learning, and aesthetics. And as usual, thank everybody for coming. and just tell you how marvelous it is to talk to Bill and to learn from him. So thank you so much.
I just want to add, I'm sorry. Hi, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I want to add that I put in the chat a link to our website where you can see future events and past events, including this one that'll hopefully go up within a few days. There's also a link there for donations if anybody's interested, and also a link for a survey that we're taking. It is in Hebrew, but if you have a few minutes and you know Hebrew, so please add your comments. We'd appreciate it. I'm going to open all the microphones for everybody to be able to thank Bill, William, I'm sorry, and Dr. Finkelman for their wonderful talk this evening. Thank you, everybody, and see you in the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you,
William.
William.
Thank you, Joe and Jill.
Thank you so much.
God bless you all and stay healthy.
C'était formidable, Bill. Formidable.
Fantastic, Bill. And good to see you.
Your message was very important.
Okay.
Thank you. Your message was very important.
Wonderful, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Everybody.
Incredible, Bill. We really, it was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you so much.
Brandon, Danny, thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, Bill.
It's a pleasure.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
I want to say, Bill, is your humanity is as impressive as your collection and your erudition.
It's a Barry. Hi.
The speeches were wonderful.
Whatever.
Oh, it's a lot
Thank
of
you,
friends. My God.
Thanks, Uncle William.
I got a guy.
Really.
Bill, that was a wonderful presentation. Enjoyed it so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And love
Hey,
to
Cedra. Hey, Cedra.
Hi. Hi, Mario.
Wow, where are you?
Hi, darling. In
Darling,
Jerusalem.
I lost you completely. Where are you?
I'm in Jerusalem. And I want to say thank you so much to William and also love to Lisa, whom I've known for many.
Absolutely, Sidra.
Yes.
We'll get it. We'll get the
I want
information.
to say that you really you made my evening, and I have some things I would happy to one day show you, and I'm really, really happy that I heard and saw this.
Marion, with the greatest of pleasure. Would be great. I would love to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Microphone was muted.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you,
Thank
Bill.
Very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It's like standing at a wedding reception. We're all waiting to say cheerio. Lovely to see you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Bye.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Wonderful talk. Enjoyed it so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you so much. Oh, Benny Zucker, hi, cousin.
On your own.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe it just goes through.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks very much. It was fabulous.
Thank you, William.
There she is again.
From our
Ready.
birthday. Thank you.
You seem to have some books there. Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Oh,
Oh
thank
my
you.
gosh.
Thank you.
I was so excited, you know, because one day I'm from Amsterdam and I fell into a collection of old Haggadahs and of Talmud volumes and of the Yad HaZakah,
Yeah.
which to my regret is still in Amsterdam and I'm in Jerusalem, but still. So you opened another picture for me again. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Bill, I also enjoyed it enormously. Thank you very much for participating, and lovely to see you looking well and healthy.
Hey, Jenya, you too. Wow.
Thank you, Bill.
People are showing their picture.
Great to see you, Bill, and love to Lisa, okay?
All right,
Dear
we'll
people,
pass it on.
if I'm not mistaken, on the 23rd, there will be the director of the Jewish Historical Museum. He really has something to tell us also. So stay in touch, I would say. I just heard that now.
Yes. No, I know him. a friend of mine for 30 years already.
I
so-
suppose so. I suppose so. And he is a specialist on the manuscripts and things, Nahon?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. It was great. Thank you again.
Okay.
Bill, it's a testament to you that so many people got on and are acknowledging how impressed they are with your presentation and your incredible collection. Continue.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate it very much.
Bill,
Here he is.
Bill, where can we get your book?
My goodness. Hadassah? Wow, wow, wow.
Bill, where can we get your book?
If you send me an email, I'll send you the particulars of the public with pleasure.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Tommy.
So this is dog beer.
Yeah.
You want dog? No.
Yeah.
Give him the other one.
Is the last one here.
No, the other one.
Oh,
I have it over there. Don't give him this.
Yeah, I will.
Bill, William, wonderful lecture. We really enjoyed it. Michael and Linda.
Yes, I see you, and I'm delighted you came. That's wonderful. Zoom is incredible because you certainly couldn't come to a personal lecture.
Well, we want to thank you for your wonderful over all these years. You were one of the very first people we met, one of the very first collectors.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Lots of love to you and Lisa.
Love to you and Lisa.
Zoe.
Bye, Bill.
Bye.
Yeah, I'm gonna write him.
Bill.
Yeah. Hi, Bill. You know that we love you so much. We are together for so many years.
I'm glad you could see it today.
And
Mama.
thank you, Lisa.
Yofi. Great.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Bill.
Hi, Faye.
Hi. That was fun.
Yes, indeed. My mentor.
Very funny.
Indeed it was.
You're well?
Yes, Baruch Hashem. Yonat.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Yonat. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Very
Oh,
well.
it's so nice that you joined. That's great.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Enjoy
Bye,
it very
Bill.
much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yofi. Oh,
Hi,
you're-
Bill. Thank you.
Okay, Chaim.
It's such a pleasure to keep on seeing you.
Well, we're waiting for your next visit.
Uh-huh.
And it's such a pleasure to experience not only your magnificent collection and your erudition, but your humanity, Bill.
Real generosity.
That's all because of my better half.
All right, give her a
I
best.
was
Give her
really a
a-
wreck when I got married.
You did? Stay well.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, Bill. Thank you again.
Take care, Bill. Lovely talk. Great to be here.
Thanks, Steve.
William, I'm going to send you the chat so you can see all the regards and thanks and wonderful things that people are writing here.
Oh, that would be great. I would love that.
Laila Tov. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.